The CDC cuts its isolation guidance in half as Fauci floats the idea of a vaccine mandate for air travel. Plus, the best-selling album of the year, it wasn't Adele. Tuesday Need to Know. Let's go. Morning, gang. This is Cheddar's Need to Know podcast for December 28th. I am Carlo Versano here with Baker Machado. Baker, good morrow to you, my friend.
Yes, good National Chocolate Covered Candy Day to you, Carlo Versano, on this 28th day of December. Only a few more days left of this insane year, Carlo. It feels like we maybe will be able to turn a corner here very soon, maybe.
Well, we thought that last year, right? You know, I don't know what to make of 2021. Because it was by no accounts a good year, like broadly speaking, but I did have a baby, so it was a really great year in that way. And it also just went so fast, which I guess is what happens when you have a kid. It does not feel like this year was an actual year. It feels like it was about 10 minutes.
I do think you're right. It's interesting because I feel like we wanted last year to be over so badly that somehow we thought at midnight last year on New Year's Eve that somehow the world would just like flip over and it would just be totally normal. I feel like we're getting at least I'm speaking for myself here. I'm getting those same sort of vibes for this year, that somehow on Friday night at midnight, I think my life just changes all over again.
Yes, it's almost like time is just a social construct that doesn't actually mean anything.
Yes. Well, that is a good sort of segue into this first story today, and some of the headlines we're following, Carlo. Big news out of Washington, as we sort of indicated yesterday, as the airlines were hoping would happen. The CDC is now halving the isolation guidelines for asymptomatic COVID patients from 10 days now to just 5. The new guidelines are regardless of your vaccination status. CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky is saying that the U.S. is about to see a wave of new Omicron cases and that the change is meant to minimize disruptions where people test positive. Now, the agency also softened the quarantine period for people who were exposed, down from 14 days now to just 5 days for unvaccinated or unboosted Americans. People who have received boosters do not need to isolate, but should wear masks in public for 10 days and also get tested 5 days after their exposure. Carlo, in some sort of sick twist of irony, having me sit inside my house quarantining for the last 10 days. Yesterday, as we jokingly said, was my breakout day. I was finally able to get out of the house. And then this news came basically saying, oh, I could have left 5 days earlier.
I think you are literally the only person in America still following the CDC
I'm a
guidelines.
Rule follower. I'm a rule follower to a fault. And it's really, it's a good quality or a terrible quality.
No, I respect that. I'm not really a rule follower, but I respect people who are. So good on you, Baker. But look, here's what the CDC is saying here. The CDC is saying, without saying, that we are moving into the endemic phase of this. That's the bottom line. If you read between the lines here, this is going to allow businesses to change their policies, which is going to help with some of the staffing shortages we've seen in airlines, in the healthcare industry, in the hospitality industry. So I think that this is a big moment in us sort of grappling with what we've all known and what we've been saying on this podcast for months now, which is that this thing is not going away. We got to learn to live with it. You know, I was thinking about this last night, and I'm going to put it up for debate here because I don't really know how I feel. But, you know, is there an argument that we're actually testing too much with this new strain with Omicron, right? And not that individuals are testing too much, but I think that, you know, it's really important that people should be able to have access to these rapid tests so they can test themselves as frequently as they want, so they can make their own decisions. But what I'm talking about is, are we testing too much in terms of like businesses, right? If you're a restaurant and you're going into like year 3 of this now, just trying to hang on, you know, by your fingernails for dear life here, should you really be required to test your staff and send them home for 5 days if they're positive? I don't know. I mean, I sort of see both sides of it now that, you know, we have this extremely infectious, but also evidently very mild.
Wait, so your counterpoint would basically be that these restaurants should keep their positive workers still in infecting the restaurant, just keeping them in the restaurant? I guess I'm trying to figure out what you're trying to say.
Yeah, I when you put it that way, it doesn't really seem right. But then again, I mean, restaurant workers, I mean, waiters go to work when they have a cold, right? And when, I mean, they
True.
shouldn't,
Yes.
I guess, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think that we should start treating this thing like we treat other, like a cold or the flu. I mean, yes, you should stay home if you have the flu, but not everybody does. Not everybody can. And I just think that there's an argument that we should start treating it that way. Look, I don't think that, no, I don't want people to go out and have to worry, I guess, that, everyone that they come in contact with is infectious. But the fact of the matter is, you're going to be exposed to this variant if you haven't been already.
Right. Well, I think you're bringing up some interesting points, and one of them is, how do you sort of judge what the pandemic to endemic phase is? And we've discussed this a lot of this podcast. For a lot of epidemiologists, it's not so much the case count number, because right now, by the way, the new cases in this country are up substantially, up 105% just over the last 2 weeks. We're now averaging 250,000 new coronavirus cases a day. But I'm putting a big but on all of this. The death rate is flat for the last 2 weeks. We have not gone up in the death rate. It has not gone down. It is basically staying stagnant at 1,200 deaths per day, which again, albeit is still incredibly high, but that seems to continue to indicate, based off of the research, that this variant is incredibly transmissible, that people are going to be getting it, but the rate of death and hospitalization, especially if you're vaccinated, continues to be low. So if anything, to what your earlier sort of, I think your idea of what you were trying to get at with businesses who are sort of hanging on by a thread, I think it gives them more of a positive outlook, knowing that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Whereas in the early parts of the pandemic, nobody even knew if they were going to be able to stay open anymore. But at least in this case, they know if their worker does test positive, there's only 5 days that they're basically off the grid instead of 10 days, which could have been cataclysmic for a lot of these small businesses.
Yeah, I think you could even go less than 5, but I'm not the CDC, so what do I know?
Well, and the biggest part in all of this, and the CDC mentioned this yesterday, Carlo, is the symptoms. The symptoms are basically the key part in all of this, because if you are
you have to see if you're asymptomatic, right?
Right. If you're asymptomatic and you're not showing any symptoms, and especially if you're vaccinated and boosted, I think the CDC is saying, okay, look, just take it easy for like a few days, but you should be fine. But if you're showing symptoms, they said, based off of their research, you're much more likely to transmit the virus to somebody else if you're showing the symptoms. So I think that is also key in all of this as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Also, I just wanted to mention this preprint that was posted yesterday, showing that Omicron enhances your immunity against Delta. What that means is that, according to, again, this study, which has not been peer reviewed yet, so we'll have to keep an eye on it. But what it's alluding to is this idea that Omicron is so infectious that it's going to help push Delta out. And then not only that, but decrease the chances that if you're infected with Omicron, you will later get reinfected with the Delta variant. If that turns out to be true, that's probably the best news since this new Omicron variant was discovered. Because it just shows that this thing is going to be, it's going to overpower these past variants and become the most, the dominant strain, but also the one with the mildest symptoms.
Yeah, and one of the last notes I'll say on this gets back to a theme we have discussed for weeks, which is now we as a public are now moving into the risk management stage of things. And now all of a sudden, does the mindset of most people change, and even businesses too, that you can be able to get on with your life knowing that if you catch COVID, it's not the end of the day, because your chances, again, of death and hospitalization is incredibly low. And just based off of the initial research, if you have been catching COVID, your symptoms are incredibly mild. Does that mean more people feel confident about entering back into the world next year in the endemic phase of where we're at right here? But another sort of interesting question that's now being posed by Dr. Fauci, he is saying a vaccine mandate for air travel should now be seriously considered. That is, major U.S. carriers canceled another 1,000 domestic flights into the week. The White House so far has balked at instituting such a mandate over logistical and legal concerns, and Fauci later clarified that he doesn't expect one to be instituted. Now, inclement weather on the West Coast added to the airline struggles with staffing shortages. Delays and cancellations are expected to ease today, that according to FlightAware. But you also have to think, now the CDC, because again, they were getting pressured heavily by these airline lobbying groups out there, the fact that they have now shortened that window of isolation for these pilots and these flight attendants from 10 to 5 days, that is going to help them with so much of their staffing shortages that they've been going through right now, in the reason why we've seen so many canceled flights. But I don't know necessarily if you institute a vaccine mandate. We've seen how well this mask mandate has been working on these videos of people on these airlines, how well that's going. And you feel awful for the poor flight attendants who have to yell at these people to get them to wear their masks. I don't know if a vaccine mandate is going to solve any of that issue either. If anything, it's going to it's going to be just as much of a mess.
Well, the reason why I disagree with that, I don't really understand the resistance to domestic travel vaccine mandates. I mean, it's not like there's any amount of freedom in air travel as it is, right? Why not another rule? Throw another rule on there, right? You're already taking your shoes and your belt off. You're already being molested by the gate agents and, you know, the TSA guys.
TSA,
yeah, I mean, like, and I don't really understand the airline industry's hesitance either, because just make the TSA deal with enforcing it. That's already what they have to do. Then you can get rid of the masks in flight, which is this rule that is why, you know, flight attendants have to, you know, do hand-to-hand combat now in addition to all of their other duties, right? But if somebody wants to have a meltdown over a vaccine mandate, they can do it in the security line. No one will even notice. Everybody else is already having a nervous breakdown while they go through security anyway. Who cares, right? Just make the TSA deal with it. Yeah, I think this just goes back to what my overarching COVID sort of, mindset is, which is that people who have been vaccinated and boosted deserve to live an easier life than those who aren't. And which is why my opinion on all COVID policy boils down to yes on any vaccine mandates and no to any other rules, including mask mandates.
No, listen, I'm in the same boat with you when it comes to that. But the other thing I'm curious about is now, if this strain in particular is not as deadly as previous strains, what point within next year do you see cities like New York City, do you see businesses ease off of mandates and start to I don't know. I'm looking for the right words here, but what I'm trying to say is at what point do you start to see the gas, sort of people back off of the gas pedal just a little bit when it comes to vaccine mandates, and things start to lighten up a little bit? At what point? Is it the case numbers? Is it the death numbers? What's the barometer that we sort of gauge the success on to basically get rid of those mandate policies?
One thing that I think that we have learned, especially, again, going back to the TSA, is it's very easy to institute new mandates and new rules, and it's much harder to get rid of them, which is why I suspect we'll probably be wearing masks at the airport for the rest of our lives, right? Just like we still have to take our shoes off at the TSA because one guy tried to blow up one plane 20 years ago. That's, again, why I think that we should start to ease off of anything other than mandates for vaccinated people.
Let's move inward, Carlo, for a moment. Let's talk about the news business. Pretty interesting stuff here. The media had a historic year in 2020 that brought in a record number of eyeballs to newspapers, websites, and television networks. 2021, not so much. According to the year-end Nielsen numbers, ratings at the cable news networks for CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC down 38%, 34%, and 25% respectively. The broadcast evening newscasts fared just a little bit better, but did see their viewership decline by 12 to 14%. Traffic, though, slowing at the big national newspapers even worse. The Washington Post's digital readership crashed 44% this last year, and the New York Times dropping 34%. That, according to ComScore. I guess, Carlo, this is sort of the Trump effect. Donald Trump continued to tell the media all the time, like, you're doing well because of me. Joe Biden said, listen, this is going to be boring in Washington. There's not going to be enough for you to cover here in Washington. And clearly you've seen sort of the reaction in the ratings and viewership numbers for media organizations as a result of that.
Well, I think that's certainly part of it. I mean, first, to the extent that there's really been a success story in the news media this year, it actually is the New York Times. They just passed 8 million subscriptions because what they've been doing is expanding into more non-news content like cooking and games, stuff like that, which has been really good for them. But these numbers are really startling if you're in this business. And look, to an extent, it's the Trump hangover, but I think that there's more to it. I think that the quote unquote, mainstream media, which is a term that I hate to use, but I use just to sort of mean the corporate media, right? We have done a very I think, an incredible disservice to our audience over the last several years, really over the last two. And I think what you're seeing now is essentially a boycott of corporate news. Journalists have become very out of touch, I think, with their beats and their audiences. And I think one thing that's always been important to me about this podcast is that we try not to talk down to people. Even when I get on my high horse, which I often do, I'm always open to feedback and criticism. When I get something wrong, I always try and correct it. And that always has seemed like a no-brainer to me. But you don't really see that in a lot of other sort of media organizations, right? How many times have you been told by some sort of like breathless news anchor or some, huge headline in a newspaper that XYZ is the biggest story in the world? You have to pay attention to it. It's going to change your life. And then like the next day, you never hear about it again. That's the kind of thing that does a lot of damage to one's respectability, and for good reason. And the problem is people start to tune out the news, right? But what happens then is, of course, nature abhors a vacuum, right? And a lot of what floods in to take its place is stuff that's either just straight up fake or untrue or severely misguided, which of course goes back to the importance of media literacy and trying to sort of understand the agendas behind the news outlets that you consume.
Next year, I think, Carlo, will be a telling moment sort of in the where the media is going, given the fact that we'll have a midterm election. So interest in the 24-hour political news cycle will increase. Because look, the last year, the biggest political story out of Washington has been, what's Joe Manchin's support when it comes to legislation. For most people, that is a boring snooze fest of a story, except for people like me and you. Next year, when you actually have candidates out campaigning, you have potentially President Trump going out there, part of the news cycle all over again. Things potentially could change and eyeballs might go up. But you also have to remember, a lot of these networks are going through a major transition as well. I mean, look at MSNBC, for instance. Rachel Maddow likely leaving that network, Brian Williams leaving that network, so they have to fill those spots as well. CNN, how much are they going to be putting towards their streaming ambitions of CNN Plus? And then Fox, which is always the conversation, how much of their viewers are leaving them for more conservative outlets like Newsmax and OAN. The problem I think I have when it comes to, and I want to stress, I have no problem with people going to a myriad of different outlets for their information. I have no problem with that because I do that. The problem I think we have now is, and this is maybe the distrust people have with the media and what we need to do a better job at, is we now can't agree on what the basic fact is. We can sort of have different perspectives about that particular fact, but we can't agree on what the most basic fact is, because everybody sort of has different perspectives of what that fact is. So that, I think, is the troubling sign here, is that we can't even really see eye to eye on the main part rather than the perspective here. All right, Carlo, meanwhile, this is a really interesting story, and I'm actually wish more companies did this. DoorDash going to start requiring all of their corporate employees, from their engineers to even their CEO, to now perform one food delivery or dash every month. That is a way to learn firsthand how the product works. The delivery app instituted the WeDash program before the pandemic, that on a voluntary basis, and they'll bring it back as a mandatory service project beginning in January, reportedly to some internal displeasure. If employees can't do the deliveries, they'll be given other tasks like shadowing customer service. But this is kind of like that show on CBS for the longest period of time, what is it, Undercover Boss, where they learn more about the actual process of how the sausage is made at their own company.
This policy is actually being hotly debated on Blind. It's like an anonymous Facebook for tech employees, like a social media platform. One DoorDash employee with a verified DoorDash email address, so it really is them. They listed $400,000 as their total compensation, and they wrote, quote, "I didn't sign up for this." So people, some of these DoorDash employees making all this money to coding, not happy that they're going to have to deliver people's food for 10 minutes once a month. Zappos, of course, famously did a version of this, making their white collar workforce do the customer service lines, right? I think Uber may have done it too back in the day. And it's a good policy. I think it's good for white collar employees to see the real life businesses and labor forces that they're destroying up close. I was talking to my bodega guy the other day, and he was complaining. I was like, I come in here every day, and you are always here. Like, are you working 7 days a week? And he was telling me that he can't get any workers. He can't get anybody.
Really?
The entire bodega workforce is being cannibalized by these apps, the DoorDashes and
Right.
Uber Eats and whatnot. And also this new thing in New York City. I don't know if you've been following this, but the new app in New York City are these 15-minute grocery delivery
Yes, they're
services.
everywhere.
Yeah, so they've also been stealing some of these people who might otherwise, do things like work at a bodega or drive a cab. It's just it's kind of sad. Speaking of cabs, have
It
you
is.
noticed that there's no yellow cabs in New York City anymore?
I mean, I see less and less and less, which is also incredibly heartbreaking. And that's a whole nother story,
That-
especially when it comes to those medallions for a lot of those individuals who are
yeah,
paying that taxi medallion for the rest of their lives. But I mean, look, Carrie Bradshaw always famously used to say, "You're not a New Yorker unless you've lived there for 10 years." I'm sort of the mindset of, "You're not a New Yorker unless you know your bodega guy on a first name basis."
right. But the cab thing, because I noticed this when I was in the city yesterday. Because if you've been to New York City, if you've lived here, if you've traveled here, one of the things about New York City is like you look down the street and the street is just covered in yellow taxi cabs, right? That's like our thing.
Right.
That's our
Not so
trademark.
much
You
anymore.
don't see them anymore. So I actually looked this
Nope.
up on the TLC website. There were 10,000 cabs on New York City streets pre-COVID. There's less than 1,000 now. That industry has been completely
Wow.
destroyed. That industry has been decimated by the pandemic, and the city didn't do anything to help those people. And the same thing I think is now happening with these apps and these services like DoorDash and whatnot. These VC-backed startups just kind of like run roughshod over the city's culture. Anyway, we're going off on a crazy tangent here, so sorry about that, folks. I just thought it was something interesting.
I was so surprised by that, Carlo. Meanwhile, we're getting some year-end numbers when it comes to album sales. The best-selling album of the year does not belong to Adele. It actually belongs to Morgan Wallen, the country star who was shut out of the music industry. That after a video on TMZ surfaced of him using a racial slur, clearly his fans couldn't care less about this. His album Dangerous sold over 3 million copies this year, including streaming, and he broke records galore, Carlo. Very few country albums were able to basically be one of the top albums for the entire year when it came to the Billboard Top 200 chart.
Pretty remarkable, right? That's more than double the sales of the Adele album 30,
I know.
which sold 82% fewer copies than her previous record. I think probably just because there aren't that many singles coming off that album like there were on some of her past records. Olivia Rodrigo's debut record came in second in terms of album sales. What a year she had, huh? That girl,
Mm-hmm.
that woman was a unknown nobody this time last year. Now they got the second best selling album in the world. It's pretty
And
incredible.
tons of Grammy
And
nominations, too.
yeah, really remarkable stuff. And then I thought this was interesting, just looking at these album charts. Fleetwood Mac's Rumors sold
Oh, best album.
850,000 copies. That's not bad for a record that came out in 1977, right?
It still is the best album, though, like pretty much ever existed. And so
Yeah.
and by the way, a lot of those sales of that one, vinyl in particular, because vinyl
Yeah.
basically the number two most purchased after streaming, it's the most purchased sort of thing that people listen to music on.
It's good. It's good to see the kids getting into little Fleetwood, right?
It's the
Okay,
best.
let's do a little more to know before we go, Baker.
All right, 4 people killed and 3 injured, Carlo, including a police officer in what authorities describe as a killing spree that took place across the Denver metro area. The unidentified suspect killed by police after opening fire at 3 separate locations. A motive right now still unknown on that story, Carlo.
Speaking of shootings, the LAPD releasing body cam video of that police shooting at a department store in Hollywood last week. We mentioned this briefly yesterday. That shooting accidentally killed a 14-year-old girl who was trying on dresses for her quinceañera. The incredibly distressing video, I don't know if you saw it. I would recommend not watching it. It shows officers responding to a man who was beating up and bloodying a woman in that store with what appears to be a bike lock before they opened fire on him. One of the bullets apparently skipped off the floor into that dressing room where Valentina or Alana Peralata, that was her name, was with her mother trying on those dresses. Really a tragic story in Los Angeles.
beyond. Meanwhile, the Chinese city of Xi'an, Carlo, has put on a strict lockdown once again. That is, they're seeing a new spike in COVID cases. The city has a population of 13 million people and has recorded 150 new cases. China's pretty much the last remaining country to keep trying for a so-called COVID zero approach, where they basically shut everything down. I mean, a city of 13 million, you shut it all down, is pretty incredible.
I'm always amazed by these when you hear about like a city in China that has like double the population of New York City and you've never even heard of it before.
Never.
It's so
Yes, same.
right. It's so amazing. And to Wall Street, where the Santa Claus rally, it looks like it's on. Stocks rose yesterday to kick off the last week of the year, which is traditionally when investors look for the so-called Santa Claus rally to boost markets, especially this year after the volatility we've seen on Wall Street the past few weeks here. S&P 500 closing at a new record. It's 69th record close of the year, Baker.
Meanwhile, Mark Zuckerberg has purchased another 110 acres of land on the Hawaiian island of Kauai, adding to a real estate portfolio that includes more than 1,300 acres. Now, Zuckerberg is paying $17 million for a former sugar plantation reservoir that failed in 2006, that in an accident that killed 7 people. The Facebook founder has faced criticism in the past for amassing his Hawaiian estate from locals who are accusing him of colonizing the island.
Zuckerberg wants all of us to go into the metaverse while he's out chilling on his palatial Hawaii. Yeah, right. And I don't know if anyone else is following the story, but I'm fascinated by it. We talked about it a while ago, that time capsule that conservationists were hoping to find buried underneath the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond, Virginia. It looks like they now have found it. Excavators first discovered a small time capsule while removing the statue's pedestal earlier this month, but it turned out to be kind of a dud. It was just sort of various like mementos from the men who built that memorial. Now they found another waterlogged box that could be this elusive capsule of Confederate memorabilia from 1887. This is rumored to contain a rare photograph of Abraham Lincoln in his casket. They're going to try and open that box as soon as today. So we'll keep you posted on what's in there. Hopefully it's not like a, Pandora's box of something. But I also don't think we should expect to see too much anything that interesting, given that it's sitting in water that's been there, I guess, for like 150 years, right?
Who knows? Maybe there's a copy of Fleetwood Mac's Rumors in there. You never know.
That would be remarkable. Okay, team. That's what you need to know for December 28th. See you mañana.